Thank you for joining, and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the Gender and Safeguards study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 14th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the third in a series of 5 regional consultations on gender. A polite reminder before we start to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking, and I'll provide another reminder of this a bit later on. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of SDCC in the Asian Development Bank, and also by Samantha Hung, Chief of Gender Equality Thematic Group in the ADB, as well as Malika Shagazatova, a Social Development Specialist on Gender and Development within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. We also have Zainab Al-Bakri, a Senior Consultant, Gender and Safeguards, also from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. All of these individuals have played various roles in the authorship and preparation of the study on and as they pertain to the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. Other experts who will be on hand for the Q&A session include Zonabel Woods and Madhumita Gupta, both of whom are also with the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, and I know they both look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to your feedback. As I mentioned, this is our third Gender and Safeguards session, and we have about 89 pre-registered participants from the CSO, NGO, and consultancy sectors in Central West and South Asian countries. About 90% of you are from outside the ADB network, which means we hope to see a good diversity and multiplicity of views, opinions, and feedback, which is, of course, why we're all here. In this consultation, Samantha Hung and Zainab Al-Bakri will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on gender and safeguards and the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like you will share your insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As we've all consented when joining, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. A reminder to join from a quiet, distraction-free area, and please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. Zonabel Woods will then ask you to unmute yourself, and if you prefer, to turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. As we are all colleagues here, let's maintain this collegial atmosphere by being respectful to each other. And Zonabel Woods and I will manage time to keep within our schedule. IT support is provided throughout this consultation, and you may ask for support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we are using today. As we're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance and a few meeting reminders on using the important buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation today in Hindi, Russian, and Urdu. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your Zoom screen and select Preferred Language. Press the Mute Original Audio button so that you can clearly hear the voice of the interpreter. For those of you listening in Hindi, Russian, or Urdu today, if you feel any of the speakers are speaking too fast and you would prefer us to slow down, you can ask us to do so by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the Reactions button. When you've clicked on the Reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you can then press the Slow Down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to the left in white. This will let the English speakers know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Then on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Then click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. You can then click on the Rename button and then type in your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the Reactions button, and then click on the Raise Hand emoji. To speak, unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. This next slide shows how we at the ADB value diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders. So let me refer you to these slides, which I will not read, but perhaps you should. It's just another reminder that these sessions will be recorded and documented and subsequently distributed for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording or distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat once again through the email address at the bottom of the screen or that's posted in the chat box. If you have any issues or concerns regarding the recording, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, please contact the Secretariat at the email address that's on the slide or that's been posted in the chat box. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide some welcome remarks and provide a context for this gender study. Mr. Dunn is a director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, also within the same department, we have Samantha Hung, who will provide an overview of the gender work in ADB, which will frame the discussion and move us forward. Samantha Hung is also chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group within the SDCC. Third, we will follow on the study findings and key issues as presented by Zainab Al-Bakri, a senior consultant on gender and safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Zainab will provide us with the findings of the Gender and Safeguard study that have been co-authored with Madhu Gupta, Malika Shagazatova, and others. Zainab will also provide us with the objectives and the methodology of the analytical study on gender and safeguards, as well as the convergence with other MFIs and then go into current policy coverage of gender and associated issues with the Safeguards Policy Statement. After this third presentation by Zainab, we will have part one of the Q&A sessions as facilitated by Zonabel Woods. Zonabel will foster a discussion on how we can better accommodate and consider some of the issues raised by Malika, Zainab, and others on implementing gender and safeguards in Asia and the Pacific. Zonabel is a senior social development specialist, gender and development in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. We will have two parts of a Q&A session, and collectively these will run for about 70 or 75 minutes. And you may ask your questions and share experiences in the chat box or through raising your hand using the emojis in the Zoom features as I explained previously. A reminder that you may also ask your questions in English, Hindi, Russian, and Urdu in the chat box or through raising your hand in the Zoom functions. Zonabel Woods will provide us with some guide questions that will be flashed on the screen that will better allow us to frame the conversations for the two discussions in the Q&A sessions. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation or a few of these before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following this consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome and contextual overview of the Gender and Safeguard Study. Over to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you very much, Azim. And good day, welcome. Really appreciate everyone joining us today for this regional consultation on gender and safeguards. It's an important topic for the region and it's a critical topic for ADB. In fact, gender equality is one of the key operational priorities for ADB, as you'll hear in this session. I'm pleased to see that we've got quite a number of people joining today, although I do hope that there will be more. We actually had a significant number of registrations for this session. Perhaps less have joined so far, but hopefully during the session more people will join us. I see also that there's a number of you that have joined previous consultation topics, and that's great. Always pleased to welcome you back to continue the dialogue. And for this gender topic, I see also that we do have some people that are joining for the first time. So please do let me take a couple of minutes, particularly for those people that are joining us for the first time, just to give you a bit more background on the update of ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement. After that, I'll then touch a little bit more on today's topic on gender. So a bit of background first. ADB's Independent Evaluation Department completed an evaluation of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement in May 2020. And that evaluation, amongst other things, recommended that ADB should update and modernize the policy. It had been 10 years, and of course, many things had changed since then, and there were some gaps emerging that we needed to address. One area, of course, was in relation to gender. And as you'll see in the presentations today, the evaluation highlighted the need for us to further strengthen the integration of gender issues into the safeguards and address some key gaps, such as on gender-based violence and on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment issues, which of course have always been issues of importance, but really in the last few years have been highlighted much more specifically as an area that we should have key coverage within the safeguard policy. Now, ADB management endorsed all of the main recommendations in the report, and then we launched a process to update the policy. That really kicked off from about August 2020. And our intention was to work over a period of about 2.5 years to undertake a series of analytical studies and consultations, and of course, drafting of the policy. At this stage, we are aiming to complete the update process for approval by ADB's board by March 2023. Although we will consider to extend that deadline if we need more time for additional consultations and to try and work towards a consensus on the policy with different stakeholders. As you've heard from Azim so far, we've completed completed consultations on 14 thematic topics. We have done, as part of that process, consultations with our developing member countries, also, of course, with civil society organizations, ADB private sector clients, and a range of other international and regional organizations. So, fairly extensive process so far. All of those consultations have been linked to background studies that we make available on our website. Most of that work so far has focused on some of the more traditional or core areas for safeguards around environment, on involuntary resettlement, and on Indigenous people safeguards, and a number of topics that are contained within those issues. But we are now coming to a range of very important cross-cutting issues, including gender. In fact, on gender, we will be having a series of linked consultations over a 3-week period. This week, we're starting with consultations that look more broadly at gender and safeguards. Then next week, starting from the 30th of May, we will have consultations on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment issues. And then the following week, we will have consultations on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics. So, we're trying to take a broad understanding of gender, as well as some focus on some key issues. Now, before getting into further details from my colleagues on the presentations, let me just give a bit more background. As you'll hear in the first presentation today, gender equality is one of the strategic priorities of ADB. It actually has been for a long time. It's guided by ADB's Gender and Development Policy from 1998. And more recently, we have ADB's Strategy 2030, which was approved in 2018. And within that, we have gender, or accelerating progress on gender equality, included as one of the 7 operational priorities. And this really sets out the strategic objectives and targets for ADB support on gender equality, including on women's empowerment. And it provides guidance for ADB's operations and for our financing and technical assistance. And it very much sets out a proactive approach on gender equality. And as part of this, we screen all of our projects for gender issues, and we seek to integrate on a proactive basis gender issues into the project design. Now, this, of course, is linked to, but sits apart from the work that we do on safeguards. We have the existing safeguard policy statement from 2009, as I've said. It includes already requirements around assessing and addressing potentially differential gender impacts and risks related to the projects. And then it requires us to address that in the context of either project design or safeguard management. So the proactive approach is there, and that really takes a longer term agenda and works at the country level. And then the safeguards comes in to manage risks at the project level. So it's important for us, I think, as part of this consultation to understand that distinction between the 2 approaches in ADB, but of course also look very carefully at how the linkages can be strengthened. And importantly, at the end of the day, it's about strengthening implementation. We want to have a stronger, more robust policy for ADB in relation to gender issues, but of course we have to think through on implementation issues. That includes also looking at linkages with other aspects of the safeguards, for example, how gender needs to be considered in the stakeholder engagement and consultation process, and then a range of areas such as on health and safety issues, on gender and the environment, on gender in involuntary resettlement processes. And of course, there are a range of intersectionality issues. You've got a range of different vulnerable individuals and groups that need consideration, and aspects such as impacts of projects that could have on the poor, on children, people of different gender orientations. So, these relationships between gender and the intersectionality issues are obviously very important as well. So just wanted to set some of that broader context for the consultation today. We'll now go into a series of presentations, firstly from the Chief of our Gender Thematic Group, Samantha Hung, followed by a presentation from Zainab Al-Bakri, who will present more on the safeguards analysis that we've done. But most importantly, we are here to listen. After the presentations, we'll open up for the moderated discussion. We'd like to hear your views, your recommendations, particularly in the context of strengthening policy and implementation. So with that, I'll now pass over to Samantha Hung for the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here today for this consultation, and it's encouraging that we have a sizable group, and I'm really excited to hear your feedback. So following on from Bruce's presentation about the broad approach to these consultations, I would like to set the scene about our approach to gender more broadly, after which I will hand over to Zainab, who will talk about the study on gender within safeguards. So in terms of our approach to gender equality, as Bruce said, we've had a proactive approach for some years. And what I've got, if we could please move to the next slide, I'd like to show you this diagram, which shows the ADB's corporate gender architecture over the years. So Bruce talked about a 1998 gender development policy, but even before that, we first adopted a policy on the role of women in development, or WID, back in 1985. And at that time, the focus was on activities that emphasized women as a special beneficiary target group. But since then, the approach evolved along with a lot of development discourse towards a gender and development approach, which saw gender as a cross-cutting issue, influencing all areas and sectors of social and economic development. And that meant that it elevated gender into the mainstream of ADB's development agenda. So since then, the gender mainstreaming approach was given formal recognition, and this paved the way for gender considerations to be mainstreamed in all of ADB's work, including the macroeconomic and sector work, all types of lending across different sectors, as well as our technical assistance operations. So since then, we've had a series of operational plans to take forward implementation of the policy. But one of the very important milestones for gender work in ADB was in 2012, when we adopted for the first time our gender mainstreaming guidelines, which introduced a 4-tier gender mainstreaming and project gender categorization system. And Bruce mentioned earlier that we screen all our projects in terms of gender, and this is the tool that we use to do so that every project will get categorized against these 4 tiers. And this has actually become well recognized as a good practice amongst other multilateral development banks. So today, our gender work is guided by our Corporate Strategy 2030. And as Bruce said, it's one of the key operational priorities under this corporate strategy. So specifically, operational priority 2 on accelerating gender equality, which we colloquially call OP2, recognizes that accelerating gender equality is one of 7 key operational priorities for the Asian Development Bank. And we have an operational plan which guides the way we implement this operational priority. So in 2021, last year, we updated our guidelines for our gender mainstreaming categories. And through this, we more explicitly set out the quality requirements for each of the 4 tiers of our project gender categorization system. And this is what we use to measure, count, and report on the extent to which gender equality and women's empowerment are integrated across ADB projects. And these guidelines provide clarity on the newer modalities that ADB uses as well. And these are actually then aggregated annually to be part of our corporate development effectiveness reporting. Lastly, this year, just coming up to 2 months ago in April, we also introduced new guidelines for the at-exit assessment of gender equality results. So what this means is these guidelines describe how we assess the extent to which we've achieved gender equality results at the time a project is completed. And this is both for our sovereign and private sector projects. If I could please move to the next slide. So on the next slide here, I'm trying to summarize our operational priority plan for accelerating gender equality visually into a simple graphic. So basically what it's showing is that this operational plan on accelerating gender equality recognizes that gender equality is critical in its own right, as well as an enabler for realizing all the socioeconomic development objectives of our developing member countries. So this operational plan for 5-year period up until 2024 highlights 5 strategic areas or pillars, if you like, and they are on the left 1 to 5. So the first one is women's economic empowerment. The second is human development, and by that we mean education, health, social protection. The third is on decision-making and leadership. The fourth is on reduction of time poverty, and by that we mean through the provision of different types of infrastructure which saves women's time. And the last is on resilience to external shocks, and those could be financial shocks, or it could be climate-induced shocks or disasters and the like. The operational plan also highlights 5 key approaches. So the first is that the importance of scaling up gender mainstreaming across all sectors and themes in which we work, integrating Sustainable Development Goal 5's transformative gender agenda, enhancing gender mainstreaming in our private sector operations, and this has actually been an area of growth in recent years. Fourthly, tackling the multiple gender inequalities through integrated solutions to the complexity of issues. And lastly, but very importantly, developing the capacity of our partner agencies in developing member countries and our private sector clients. So it is in this context that ADB is very committed to lift its game to go beyond our well-established gender mainstreaming approach towards a more transformative gender equality agenda, which is aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 5 and also strongly interlinked with the achievement of other sustainable development goals. If I could please move to the next slide, and in which I will explain our gender mainstreaming system in a bit more detail. So I already explained before that our gender mainstreaming system is well recognized as a multilateral development bank good practice. So how it works in a bit more specificity is that our 4-tier project categorization system ranges from a lowest category of no gender elements right up to a highest category of what we call gender equity theme. And these are applied to all ADB projects, whether public sector or private sector, so that each project is assigned one of these categories, depending on the extent to which they have integrated gender issues into their design. So how it works is that the process starts from the very early stages of project development and requires gender analysis and sex disaggregated data collection to inform the meaningful and proactive gender designs that can address the issues that the analysis raises. And these designs should narrow gender gaps and empower women wherever possible. So the way we also do it is that our gender categorization system uses a tool called a Project Gender Action Plan, or a GAP, and that is in effect a roadmap for gender mainstreaming and monitoring of gender results at project level. So a gender action plan is a requirement for any project that is categorized in the 2 highest categories of gender equity theme or effective gender mainstreaming. It's also important here to mention that gender considerations in terms of mitigation and safeguards measures, these are required for all projects irrespective of the gender categorization. And there is also an established in-house check and balance or quality assurance system in order to confirm any project's gender category and ensure that the quality thresholds of each category are met for any given project. So our corporate strategy 2030 that I mentioned earlier also sets ambitious targets to support gender equality through gender inclusive project designs and at least 75% of our total operations by 2030, and 55% of those should be in the top two categories, effective gender mainstreaming and gender equity theme. We also have a target for our completed operations to ensure that we achieve the intended gender equality results. And that target is that 80% of gender mainstream projects, those in the top two categories, deliver their intended gender equality results by 2024. And this means that gender performance indicators are part of our corporate results framework, and we track them quite closely and we report on them on an annual basis. So if we could please go to the next slide, which is actually my last slide before I hand over. So Bruce talked earlier about the Independent Evaluation Department report and its findings with respect to the safeguards policy. And in that, it highlighted that the safeguards policy addresses gender through three general compliance areas. Firstly, consideration of females as a vulnerable group in social impact assessments. Secondly, the need for gender sensitive consultations. And thirdly, the need for gender responsive grievance redress mechanisms. The report also noted that the policy and parts of our operations manual have not evolved sufficiently to provide the necessary guidance on emerging issues, including, for example, sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, or what we sometimes call SEA. And those are issues related at the work site and broader impacts on risks on communities. The report further notes the need to expand the coverage of the policy to clarify and integrate safeguards aspects of cross-cutting social dimensions, including labor and working conditions, community health and safety, gender, labor influx and migrant workers, stakeholder engagement, and some of which are currently addressed in other strategies and policies. So the report concluded that there are emerging gender risks that cut across environmental safeguards, health and safety, gender and social protection, and these may require a more integrated approach. And they also further stress the importance of sufficient operational guidance through the operational manual and good practice notes and training and the like for staff and clients. So based on this review and recommendations and the broader background, we have carried out a benchmarking exercise for gender and safeguards, comparing with other MDB, Multilateral Development Bank frameworks. And I would like to invite our key consultant, Zainab, who worked with us on this, to present the findings of this benchmarking study. Thank you. Over to you, Zainab.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Samantha, for that first part. Here, what I will do is to present the results of the benchmarking study that was undertaken to compare the situation of gender and safeguards in the ADBs safeguards with those of other institutions. So the objective of the study was to do this comparison, especially focusing on ADB's current policies, strategies and practices of work on gender and policies and approaches to gender as used by peer multilateral development banks. The benchmarking exercise covered peer MDBs, safeguards policy frameworks, implementation structures, modalities, practices, and resources. The study involved identifying gaps, strengths, and weaknesses of current ADB approaches, and significant differences with peer MDBs, and what were some of the lessons learned and emerging issues, as well as some of the operational implications. Just to summarize a little bit, what were the findings from the examination of gender in the 2009 safeguards policy statement of ADB. Can we go to the next slide, please? And here there were 4 points that came out very clearly. The first related to the juxtaposition between safeguards and the aspirational development aspects which Samantha referred to. And the document generally sees that the current balance between gender in the safeguards and gender in the more do-good approach of ADB was appropriate, and that there was nothing wrong with the way this balance was maintained. It was thought specifically that gender and development issues were already receiving specific and focused attention in ADB's operations through the implementation of ADB's policy on gender and development and the accompanying sections of the operations manual on gender and development as well. However, it was found that issues such as gender-based violence, sexual harassment, sexual orientation, and gender identity were absent from the SPS, as well as gender aspects of very important issues to any safeguard document, such as climate change and labor and working conditions. And it was felt that generally, gender considerations needed to be reflected more clearly throughout the safeguards in order to mitigate gender-specific safeguard risks and to enhance gender inclusion. Next slide, please. So what the benchmarking study did was that it looked at several peer institutions, and these were the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And to undertake this comparison, because it was such a vast exercise, it was decided to focus on 3 key issues for comparison. The first one was whether there was a mention of gender equality in the safeguard policy or vision. The second was the extent to which gender-specific provisions were mainstreamed into the performance standards and requirements. And finally, to look at what was the type of guidance that was operational guidance in particular that was provided in order to facilitate implementation support. As a result of this benchmarking exercise, it was highlighted that the ADB policies were characterized by several gaps, whether in terms of practices and resources when compared with those used by peer institutions as regards to gender in safeguards. So now I will go over each of the 3 areas of comparison. The first one regards, as I said, whether there's a strong gender commitment in the opening policy and vision of the safeguards statement. And here, when we did the comparison, we found that the Inter-American Development Bank had both a strong commitment to fostering gender equality in its opening policy statement, and also it is the only MDB which has a standalone gender standard. When we looked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, we also found that it made a very strong gender equality statement, and mentioning that gender is a fundamental aspect of a modern, well-functioning market economy and democratic society, and that the institution is committed to preventing gender discrimination and promoting gender equality within its mandate. The AAIB also states that it seeks to support projects that make infrastructure accessible to everybody. Its policy statement indicates that it will provide client support to identify potential gender-specific opportunities and risks and to develop mitigation measures to avoid such risks. And they clearly single out measures to identify and address risks related to gender-based violence. Can we move to the next slide, please? Regarding the extent to which gender-specific provisions are mainstreamed into the different performance standards and requirements, the study found that there was quite a variation as to the extent to which there was an incorporation of gender provisions in performance standards. The ones that received the most gender-specific provisions related to generally the assessment and management of social and environmental risks, labor and working conditions, involuntary resettlement, indigenous peoples, and stakeholder engagement. Among all of the institutions that were compared, again, the Inter-American Development Bank had the most comprehensive coverage with explicit mention of gender considerations across the various standards. In addition to a standalone gender standard, as I mentioned earlier, the EBRD also integrated gender across the performance standards with a specific focus on labor and working conditions. Both the World Bank and IFC also integrate gender considerations across the different standards, although to a lesser extent. And this integration is primarily in the involuntary resettlement and indigenous people standards. Finally, we looked at the type of guidance material. Can we move to the next slide, please? The type of guidance material that was provided for implementation support. And I would like to emphasize this because, as Bruce mentioned earlier, implementation is really very important. So we found that after developing its environmental and social framework, the World Bank noticed that there were certain gaps related to gender. And so they developed 3 good practice notes to support ESF implementation. There was a general one on gender and 2 more specifically addressing issues of sexual exploitation and harassment, abuse and harassment, and the other one addressing issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. It's important to note that these good practice notes are not policies in themselves, but they are more of an advisory nature and are not necessarily mandatory. Meanwhile, the IFC has a set of guidance notes accompanying the performance standards, and also it has developed several resources to assist in undertaking gender responsive measures within its projects. So resources such as addressing how companies can handle and avoid sexual harassment within the company, and elements on how to evaluate whether a company has specific policies in that aspect and how to deal with the issue. The EBRD also has specific guidance. What is interesting about the EBRD guidance is that it targets specific stakeholders. So for instance, because it works a lot through financial intermediaries, it has specific guidance on how to apply performance standard number 2 on labor and working conditions. Next slide, please. Now, as a result of this benchmarking study, we came up with certain key issues which we felt were worthy of further consideration by the ADB and could possibly be a source of recommendations in the new and updated safeguards. So the first issue that we thought was important to highlight was that of providing a strong gender equality commitment right from the start in the vision of the safeguard policy. So to put up front that the institution will support a strong gender equality commitment, and we felt that the importance of that was that it would set the tone for the rest of the work on gender and safeguards. Secondly, I think along with peer institutions, it is important to move towards an integrated social and environmental risk assessment rather than doing separate risk assessments for separate topics, whether, as is the case in the current safeguards for involuntary resettlement or indigenous peoples or in the environment, but to have rather to have an integrated assessment. Third, to ensure that there is a very strong integration of gender-specific provisions across all the performance standards, and not only the ones related to involuntary resettlement or indigenous peoples, which tends to be the case. We did not say that we do not necessarily recommend that there has to be a standalone gender standard if gender is adequately provided for and mainstreamed into all the performance standards. We also felt that the aspects of do no harm as undertaken by safeguard teams and the doing good as undertaken by gender teams required increased coordination and synergy. And we felt that that would result in improved gender equality results. Although we realize that there is quite a lot of training and capacity building going on, but we felt that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on such learning and capacity building throughout the institution, but also addressing executing agencies and clients in the borrowing countries. We also felt it was important to learn the lessons from previous experiences and projects, specifically lessons emanating from complaints that might have surfaced to the accountability mechanisms of different institutions, including, of course, ADB. And finally, we felt that the updated safeguards need to be accompanied by a very clear inclusion of gender-related terms in its glossary, currently not the case, and also that gender-related aspects need to be included in the social and environmental exclusion lists. Thank you. I'll stop here. I look forward to hearing comments, questions on this benchmarking study and its results. Thank you very much. I hand over back to Zonibel.
Thanks, Dr. El-Bakri and Samantha, for your very comprehensive and, detailed presentations, and for the wonderful overviews on the gender issues that you've raised for all of us to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's Independent Evaluation Division publicly, and the need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy for around March 2023 or so. The performance standards established by organizations such as the World Bank, the IFC, the IDB have set a high bar, and the comparators presented will offer us some food for thought on where the ADB will pitch its gender and development issues and incorporate its operational policy 2030, and more specifically, the OP2 as a subset of that within the revision of the safeguards policy statement. So we hope we can get into some of the feedback and an opportunity to discuss and delve into some of these issues during the discussions arising from this Q&A session. Before we head to that, I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing this discussion. We have about 70 to 75 minutes for these two Q&A sessions. Before we start, just to note that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please send the message to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, who are members of the team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question under their own name to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. We will now have the first part of our open discussion. This is why we're mostly here, as moderated and facilitated by Zonibel Woods of the ADB. You will see on the screen some guide questions flashed now, but feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve or mainstream gender and related safeguards issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. And a reminder that you can also ask questions through posting them in the chat box or virtually through raising your hand in Zoom, and by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and posting your question in either English, Hindi, Russian, or Urdu. So with that, over to you, please, Zonabel.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. We have about 70 participants this afternoon, and we look forward to a really great discussion about what we presented to you this afternoon, but more importantly, we would like to hear about your reactions to what we presented, your experiences and your reflections. So we have the guiding questions, but before we get into those, just a reminder that we have, as Azim has mentioned, we have interpretation available. We also have about 35 minutes for this part of the discussion. We'll have a break and then we'll come back for another 30 minutes. So please feel free to post your question in the Q&A box, or send it to one of our colleagues, or raise your hand. I see that we have one hand up, so I will give you the floor, Abia Akram, if you'd like to speak, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the ADB for organizing this very important consultation around the gender inclusivity and how we can safeguarding on the. It's really important, like we are seeing globally, there's a huge gap that exists in the gender equality and seeing all the perspective from the inclusion of women and girls with disability. I just want to highlight a bit because we know like 10 to 15% of the total population are persons with disability, and 50% of them are women and girls with disability, and they are facing systematic challenges in the gender safeguarding, how we can provide them the equal opportunities, equal representation, the infrastructural barriers, communication barriers. So within this system of the policy and the upgrade of the safeguard within the ADB, how we can link it with the practical examples of those women and girls with disabilities who have been advocating, how we are linking it with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and how we can see our policies more inclusive in terms of providing them the accessibility, in terms of providing them all that information in accessible format, so they can also contribute, they can also participate in all the dialogues. The sign language interpretations are also important. And thirdly, how we see the visibility and the engagement of more voices of women and girls with disability. We have been working with site savers, with the global network of women with disability. We have been contributing in the Asia Pacific region in all diversified areas, but we see like it is much needed to address the needs of women with diverse disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abia, for raising those issues. Before I turn to my safeguards colleagues, I want to just take one more question from Syed. So, if when you speak, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself and your organization, that would be helpful, so we all know where you're coming from. So Syed, would you like to take the floor, please? You're on mute. We cannot hear you. I think you're still on mute.
I'm not.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just introduced myself as SQ Zama. I am a senior activist, trade union activist in coal industry of India, representing Indian National Mine Worker Federation, which is affiliated to the national organization INTAC. So I have heard very carefully all my previous speakers. I have no much point to say, but I would only say that the safeguards against gender bias in India is not very elaborative or very clear. Although we have some legislative safeguards, but that is not enough. Whether it is against sexual harassment on workplace or whether in terms of equal wages for women and male and female in any industry, there is still difference in wage levels and other social security measures in India. So uh, they, instead of having a very firm and very wide legislative protection, either at federal level or as at state level, we need a very comprehensive law to make it very clear. Although the Constitution of India guarantees gender equality, but in practice it is seldom followed. So, what I feel that legislative intervention is very much needed to give a general protection against gender bias as enshrined in the Constitution of India. The second point I wish to highlight is because I work in coal industry, which is under stress because of climate change, and then we have to ensure that the provisions of just transition is enforced. So we very frequently discuss about just transition, but I'm sorry to state that the present government in India for last few years, they have no social dialogue with other stakeholders, but with particularly with trade unions. There are five central trade unions operating in coal industry, but for last 5 6 years, the government of India has no formal or informal institutional dialogue with any of the trade unions. Number third point I want to highlight that issues arising out of climate change, which are with just transition. As our Honorable Prime Minister has committed that we have to achieve net zero by 2070, as spoken in COP26, he has extended the date by 20 years against the target of 2050. But in back to our country, we are not aware because all such subjects related to climate change, it is never brought into the ambit of parliamentary discussion. If some member raises question, they only answer limited. There is no comprehensive discussion as such on climate change or the intricacies of just transition, and it is always acted upon out of the parliament at government level, never in parliament. The
Thank,
fourth point I want to
okay,
highlight, I am making short. I will end. I will end. Thank
okay.
you. The fourth and last point I want to highlight, what we are experiencing in the coal industry. India is second or third largest coal producer in country. We are working. We have myself worked in coal industry for last 4 decades. What I experienced today, even today, that despite constitutional guarantee, there is no equality in social in terms of wages for female employees, in terms of social security measures. They
একটু
don't. Even
টানিয়ে রাখবেন তো।
just I may conclude within 1 minute. So thank you very much. So these are the factors as a trade union activist we are fighting, we are struggling, we are confronting the government on all fronts at our industry level and also at the government level. But we still that a forum like what we are discussing now will be quite helpful in inviting the attention, attracting the attention of the government of India to at least on such mutual interest issues there should be social dialogue. Thank you very much.
So
Thank you.
I am from Bangladesh, and
Could you hang on just 1 second, Mr. Amirul Haq? I will call on you in just a moment. I've seen that both Mr. Amirul Haq and Mr. Nara Nath would like to speak, but maybe we can take these first two questions and then I'll come to you. Okay, thank you so much. So we have one question around the inclusion of disability issues, and we have other very important points from Mr. Syed. So I will ask my colleagues first, Madhu to come in, followed by Samantha Hung, and then followed by Bruce to speak to some of the issues related to labor and social dialogue that you brought up. So if I could ask Madhu to start off with our responses.
Thank you, Zoni, and
Okay,
thank you, Abia, for very good set of questions. I would start by saying that the safeguard policy update really narrows down and looks into what would be the the disproportionate impacts on different population groups as a result of environmental and social impacts, like whether if land is acquired, what is the impact on gender and safeguards, that is on women, even on population groups, as well as intersectionality. For example, you're a woman and you have disability. What impact will this particular project will have on it? And based on that, you conduct a social impact assessment. You do the assessment, you do a consultation process to devise what would be the mitigation measure so that you cause no harm, as well as you try and enhance, make some enhancement measures so that you can improve their lives. So the policy update really narrows down into dealing with the adverse impacts of the environmental and social impacts. But while at the same time, in your comment, you also had issues on advocacy. You also had issues on how gender and disability inclusion, can happen and how that can take place. My colleague Samantha, she will give you more details on how we plan. But when we come to the policy update, what we are really thinking is from the point of view of maybe expanding on the different vulnerable groups, as well as making ways and having appropriate guidelines to understand the intersectionality issues. For example, if you overlay the different vulnerabilities, how does it pan out? And what kind of mitigation measure you need to address through a project. What I would like to point out is that not everything can be sorted out in a safeguard policy. We can only deal with the people that are affected by the project. But there are also broader aspects of gender and disability where you need issues of like having proper legal environments to ensure that gender equality is met and disabled people get their appropriate rights and their issues are considered. So from the safeguard policy side, we would really look at in terms of the vulnerabilities. So just want to make that very clear at the outset. ADB, when it processes a project, it follows a project cycle approach where initially it identifies all the impacts, like what are the social impacts, who are the people who are living in the project area, what are there indigenous people in the area, what kind of impacts there will be. So what we call is an initial poverty social analysis. This is followed by a more detailed poverty social analysis, which basically considers what kind of benefits can be provided to people irrespective of gender, and also depending on the different vulnerabilities so that people can access those benefits. So there is this dimension as well, which deals with the more positive aspects of the project and how enhancement measures can be appropriately included in the project design. And the safeguard policy mostly applies to the negative impacts of the project and deals with all kinds of vulnerabilities, whoever is affected, adversely affected. I'll stop there and hand over to Sam.
Hi, Sonny, is it okay if I just jump in briefly now?
Hello.
Yes, please jump in, Sam. Okay, just quickly to add on to what Madhu was.
हम बोलना चाहता हूँ थोड़ा वो मेरा प्रश्न ये है कि जो
Keep going, Sam. It's sorry, okay. I just was worried people couldn't hear me. So I'll just be quick. Thank you very much about the question about people with disability and in particular women with disability. It's a very important topic. So from the ADB gender policy side, to supplement what Madhu said about in the context of safeguards, our operational priority 2 plan for gender equality does have explicit recognition of intersectionality and within that disability as one of the different axes of discrimination that add to gender discrimination. So it is something that we recognize in our analysis. And one way that we often see this play out in project designs is in the context of infrastructure. So when we design inclusive infrastructure designs that benefit women, they also by design tend to also be more likely to benefit people with disabilities. So that those two we see go together, but of course the disability inclusive designs can be more specific as well. So ADB also a year or two ago approved a strengthening inclusive disability inclusive framework for how we approach our approach to inclusion for persons with disability across the board. And as part of that work, the gender team will be also developing a gender and disability toolkit, which aims to inform project design in a more proactive way to address the specific needs of persons with disabilities from a gender lens. So that's just a little bit about sharing how we are trying to approach that specific topic. Thank you. Back to you, Zoni.
Thank you. Bruce, would you like to add anything here and respond to some of the questions, issues raised by Mr. Syed?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, for our other colleagues that are joining the call that are keen and anxious to also share their questions, just hold on, we'll be with you very briefly. I'll just try to give time to responding to each of the issues. To Mr. SQ Zama, thank you very much for your points. I'll just briefly respond on a number. I think firstly, you raised an important issue in the Indian context about the legal framework, but of course this could apply in other countries. Obviously having that framework in place for non-discrimination, for equality, for women, for other vulnerable groups, and having, of course, that being implemented effectively and with support is obviously a critical thing. When we come in with our project level financing and applying our project level safeguards, obviously where there are gaps in country legal frameworks, we will try to address that, identifying the issues and the risks, doing stakeholder consultation, having mitigation measures in place, and then setting up legal agreements with the government or the implementing agencies to still try and address those issues. But obviously where you have major gaps at a national level, that makes implementation harder and risks harder. So that's something that we're aware of. It's also an area where ADB is willing to support. We do provide technical assistance to governments or agencies, and we can also provide more extensive resources through our lending program. So if government's willing to make policy reform, that's something that we're willing to support, because it obviously needs to go hand in hand for the long-term agenda. So that was the first point. Secondly, you spoke about labour issues, and I appreciate you bringing up that context. And I do know that we've got other colleagues from trade unions joining the call, so I think we'll have a chance to talk about some of these issues, but I'll just start briefly there. Obviously, there is a critical issue around labour, workers involved in projects, and gender equality. There's a range of issues, of course, from non-discrimination in hiring practices, for having safe working conditions. Obviously, we need to work towards avoidance and mitigation of any risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the workplace. There is a need for effective grievance redress mechanisms for workers so that when they have concerns that they can raise them. But of course, they need to be able to do that in a way that is free of reprisals. And that's something that we would not support. But of course, their perception that they can make their complaints known without being adversely affected in their employment is a critical issue. So that's something that we would like to make clear in our policy framework, and then of course to work on the implementation side. Implementation, we have to have a range of mechanisms in place, from legal agreements, procurement arrangements in contracts, remedy in the case that issues occur. But of course, it's something you have to be working very carefully with, because you have contractors and subcontractors, etc. And I think that's where also the collaboration with unions or civil society on the ground for monitoring can be very important. But I'll stop there because I know other colleagues have got points on labour, and we can come back to some of those issues a bit further. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And we'll try to get to all of your questions, but if you can just try to please raise your hand so that I can keep track of who's next. And I noted that Mr. Naranath wanted to speak. So if you'd like to take the floor now, Mr. Naranath, we have interpretation.
हमने चैट में भी भेजा है, वो नेपाली में है। मैं थोड़ा, मेरा प्रश्न क्या है कि एडीबी फंडेड जो प्रोजेक्ट है ना, उस प्रोजेक्ट में एडीबी ने जो फंड करेगा, तो वहाँ दूसरा ठेकेदार ने काम करेगी, और वो दूसरा ठेकेदार को एडीबी का नीति रणनीति के बारे में कुछ पता नहीं है। जो 4 वर्ष में जो आपने प्रेजेंटेशन में आया है, उस टाइम जो मूल्यांकन के टाइम में जो प्रोजेक्ट है, वो प्रोजेक्ट का कंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी और वही कंपनी काम करने वाला मजदूर और संबंधित ट्रेड यूनियन के सहभागी करके वो एडीबी का जो रणनीति है वो रणनीति बुझाना जरूरी है, क्योंकि वहाँ ट्रेड यूनियन अधिकार, लैंगिक विभेद का काम होता है। इस विभेद रोकने के लिए एडीबी ने एक पहल करना पड़ेगा। नेपाल में वो अभी तक नहीं हो रहा है, क्योंकि एडीबी ने पैसा देता है और सरकार ने समझौता करता है, और वही वजह से चाहे एक कंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी को चाहे ठेका देता है। इसलिए ये लिंक जो है ना, श्रमिकों के लिए और सहभागिता के लिए वो पता नहीं है। एक दूसरा है वो जो कंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी है, कंस्ट्रक्शन साइट है, उसमें एक सरोकार वाला समाज बन के एक समिति बनता है। अभी नेपाल में क्या हो रहा है कि वही समिति ने सब काम कर रहा है, ट्रेड यूनियन को उसने वहाँ पहुंच बढ़ाने कोशिश कर रहा है कि वो वहाँ हस्तक्षेप कर रहा है। इसी काम के लिए भी एडीबी का हस्तक्षेप होना चाहिए। अभी वो एडीबी का अब हस्तक्षेप नहीं हो रहा है। तीसरा प्रश्न है कि एडीबी फंडेड प्रोजेक्ट में एक प्रोविजन होना चाहिए कि महिला कामदार निश्चित %, अभी विश्वव्यापी रूप में 33% का जो आवाज आ रहा है, वो फंडेड में वो अपना रणनीति में वो डालना चाहिए कि 33% महिला को काम में अनिवार्य करना वो चाहिए, एडीबी का रणनीति में होना चाहिए। यही मेरा प्रश्न है, मैंने चैट में भी भेजा हूँ। थैंक यू वेरी मच। मैं क्यूपेक नेपाल का अभी मैं प्रतिनिधि परिषद प्रमुख है नेपाल की तरफ से। इतना ही मेरा प्रश्न है एडीबी के साथ में। धन्यवाद।
Thank you very much, Mr. Naranath, and we were, I think, able to catch most of that through the interpretation that was provided. But if you can also, I'm not sure if you're able to turn the channel for yourself to Hindi so that you could hear some of the interpretation as well when we respond. But I know we have 2 other people that wanted to speak. So I'll call on Chandra first and then followed by Vipul. And if you could just introduce yourselves and the organization that you're coming from, please. Chandra, you have
good afternoon to everyone. I have no question, just I want to raise 2-3 points for your information and consideration. You see, the biggest thing is whatever policies are made or are made according to the demand. Things remain fine, but when it comes to its implementation and review, its position is not very good, especially in India.
Okay, we cannot hear you
much
anymore,
more
so,
needs to be done when it comes to gender equality. The presentation is very well done and suggestions are also good. What today what presentation we have seen is very well done and suggestions are very good. But the Asian Development Bank will have to focus on all these facilities and increase the access of women. For this, it is most important to ensure the participation of women at the level of policy implementation. Whether it is a woman or man, the biggest problem is that despite having the right in law, they are not getting the benefit of it. Some, their making of policy or law will not work. Above all, there should be participation and bilateral dialogue should be strengthened, and the implementation of the outcome of the dialogue should be accelerated. As a question, we want to raise whether it is a matter of security or other issues. It is not sure whether GRC should be constituted for implementation at the workplace or how any mechanism should be developed for this. Unless there is credibility of participatory or dialogue method in the implementation mechanism, social security will not be talked about or their implementation will not be possible. Therefore, I would request that Asian Development Bank should focus on these problems and ensure their resolution should be a priority. That's all. Thank you.
I am in the line.
Thank you. Thank you,
I am from Bangladesh.
Chandra. I'm going to go to Vipul now. And I note that you would like to speak, Mr. Amirul, so I'll call on you after that, okay? It's just, I saw hands up and I hadn't seen your hand, but you will be next, okay? Just bear with us. Okay, Mr. Vipul.
Thank you. You are hearing me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, you're a little bit choppy. Maybe, I'm not sure
Hello?
if the signal is so good.
Hello? Are you hearing me?
Very faintly. We can't hear you so well.
Okay.
Oh, now it's better.
Yeah, I am Vipul Pandya from India. Bankam Mazdoor Sangathan, we affiliated with BWI. My one question that in regarding the Mr. Narnath spoke before me, it's a very good raise the point that in India there is a long chain between the principal employer and workers. So ADB project signed by the government, and government is a principal employer. But there is a long chain. The principal employer, then principal contractor, then a subcontractor, then other contractor, then or another contractor, and gang leader and workers. So subcontractor doesn't know about the ADB rules, regulation, and agreements with the governments. So there is no any implementation of core labor standards mentioned in the our agreements. So that is a big problem in our projects. That is one part. Second is
sorry, people, could you maybe, I think some of my colleagues are having a hard time hearing you. Would it be possible to move closer to the phone or somewhere where there's a better signal?
Okay. So I speak or not?
Yes, we would like for you to speak, but it's a little bit difficult to hear. So we have two options. Maybe you can move to somewhere where there's a better signal so we could hear you better. And in the meantime, I would just go to Mr. Amirul while you're looking for a better place, and then I will come back to you. If that doesn't work, people, if that doesn't work, then maybe you can type into the chat box. But let's try. First, I will go to Mr. Amirul and then come back to you. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm actually from Bangladesh, and already you mentioned my name. I'm Amirul Haq Amin. I'm the president of National Government Workers Federation. First of all, you see in this arrangement, there is the translation facility for the Hindi, for the Urdu, for the Nepalese, and some other more languages. But unfortunately, there is no arrangement for Bengali. I think this is also one kind of discrimination for Bengali people. Anyway, I am actually is a trade union people in Bangladesh in the garment sectors. And the garments, this is actually the biggest industrial sector in Bangladesh. Now there are 5,000 garment factories and 4.2 million workers. Among these 4.2 million workers, 75% are women, and this sector actually covering 83% of our foreign export. So you see, the important issue is in the garment sector, there is the sexual harassment. Another thing is equality is absent in this sector. And the third issue is Bangladesh government till now did not ratify the ILO Convention on 90. So my question, I know very well that ADB is one of the development partner of Bangladesh. So I will be happy to know that how ADB can influence the Bangladesh government to ratify the ILO Convention on 90, as well as how they can implement the laws for the equality and against of the sexual harassment, specifically these laws, how the Bangladesh government can implement in the garment sector. ADB how can play the vital role in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Amarolan, for that important point about how ADB can engage with governments that we work with. So we'll come back to your question. In the meantime, I will call on, Vipul has just disappeared, I think. So I don't see him, so maybe we'll come back to him.
Hello.
Oh, you're here. Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
My point is that I have some suggestion that gender-specific OHS safeguards and provisions in I-500 projects, because we see that women workers have no specific OHS equipments. And second, there is a problem of worksite toilet facilities, adequate gender-specific in there is no adequate facilities. And third is there is no provision such as maternity leave and other social security measures for especially women workers. So that is my suggestion to include these three provisions. And last, in India, very, very hot in summer, 47-degree, workers working in the road construction. So there is no any safeguard to protect the workers. So my suggestion is that in 3 to 4 hours in noon, rest time should be given in the heat wave period, particularly April to May, June. That is my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And just to make sure that we really get that, your question and your comment on the record, can I also ask you, because it was still a little bit choppy, so can I ask you if it's possible to type it into the chat so that we make sure we really capture your comment? So I will just go to my ADB colleagues to respond to your questions, starting with Sam, and then yes, so Sam and then Bruce, please.
Sure. Thank you, Zoni. I'm not sure if I caught all the details of the questions, but I'll just pick up on a couple of points that I think I heard. So firstly, I think Naranath was asking about targets for ensuring 30% of women got jobs or something along those lines. So I just wanted to explain that in terms of our proactive approach to gender, we do often incorporate targets to encourage women's employment. And in fact, women's employment and jobs created, quality jobs created, is one of our indicators amongst our corporate framework for gender equality, one of the sub-indicators. So the way we normally do that is that at any project level through our gender analysis, we often look at any jobs that will be created from the project or as a result of the project, and we try to establish a benchmark baseline in terms of how many women versus men or different groups of women and men are currently in those jobs. And then on that basis, we always try to establish a target which is more aspirational in nature, so that we actually promote women's access to good quality jobs, and also sometimes encourage them and help them into jobs where they were traditionally less represented, jobs that may have been predominantly more men. So I guess my summary point is that encouraging women's quality employment is very core to our gender equality work, and we try to do that wherever possible. Just maybe quickly on the question, I think Mr. Amano, it was a bit hard to follow, but I think he was talking about ILO convention and issues of sexual harassment. And just to say that, this is a ILO convention that we are very familiar with. It is also one that unfortunately is not actually ratified by very many countries. And I think in terms of our developing member countries, there's only one that has currently ratified it, and I think that is Fiji. So I think that for us, the role that ADB can have around that kind of thing is one around policy dialogue to start to engage partner governments about these issues. And through that, we can potentially influence the strengthening of legal frameworks. It's not something that we can have direct influence over, obviously, because it's a autonomous government decision, but we can try to engage around the importance of these kinds of issues to try to put it onto the agenda. So maybe with that, I'll leave it, and Bruce might have something to add.
Yes, thank you very much, Sam. So thank you so much for all of the speakers so far, Mr. Naranath, Mr. Singh, Mr. Pandya, and Mr. Aman. Really appreciated those thoughts. Let me try to pick up on some of the issues that have not been responded to so far, just in summary. Firstly, to Mr. Naranath, I appreciated your comments and concerns about a specific project. While you haven't mentioned exactly what that project is, and perhaps in this consultation, it's maybe not the right opportunity to speak about those details. We do take those issues very, we do have concern about those project level issues. And actually what I could offer to do, if you'd like to provide some further information, either directly to me in the chat, or I can provide an email contact for you as well. We'd be happy to get further information, and we can put you then in touch with our colleagues that are actually working on the project. So that's something that we can do beyond this consultation today. But just to speak a little bit more broadly around some of the issues you raised, and certainly there are issues and challenges in working with contractors. ADB does apply the core labour standards. So of course, things like freedom of association and collective bargaining are clearly part of those core or fundamental labour standards. So there should not be restrictions for workers, but I understand and do realise that these things can happen. It's an area that we want to work more on. Today, for this consultation, we're focused, more on gender issues, but we are looking to include a dedicated standard on labour and working conditions in the policy, which would address this. But I think the key issue also is for strengthened arrangements in procurement. We need to make sure that these arrangements, requirements, have to cascade down the chain from. Obviously, we have a legal agreement, say with a government, but then it has to cascade down through procurement to contractors, subcontractors, their subcontractors, etc. So those requirements, and then clearly capacity to implement and monitoring. So these are key areas that we do need to work on more with the government authorities, but also with the contractors themselves. But please do reach out on the project-specific issues. Just pick up on some of the other points. I think Sam has addressed a number of the points already. Perhaps Mr. Pandya, one of the points that you had raised, I think that Samantha's not responded on, was around issues, for example, around gender facilities, gender-specific personal protective equipment, basically making sure that workplaces are suitable and safe, and that the right sort of equipment is in place. That's a key issue, and something we're looking to strengthen through the provisions on occupation and community health and safety, which are also part of the safeguards and need to link obviously to the gender. Again, implementation, monitoring and capacity development are critical there, as well as the contractor requirements. And yeah, I think we've generally covered the key issues, but of course, if not, please feel free to come back and we can follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam and Bruce. And I think there are a couple of questions in the chat box, but maybe this is a good time for us to take a short break. I'll hand it over to Azim, who will take us into the break, and we can come back and continue the conversation. But feel free to put in whatever questions you have in the chat box, and we'll try to get to all of them. And if not, we'll try to answer also in the chat box. So over to you, Azim.
Thanks so much, Zonibel, and thanks to everyone for sharing your views and articulating your opinions, asking your questions. As Zonibel said, we're going to now pause for a 5-minute break. Before we do, during the break, may I humbly request that you think about how we can improve these consultations? And the question is this: what specific improvements can we make to the format or the way we engage with you as stakeholders during these sessions? And when we return after the second half of the Q&A session, we will be asking that specific question to you in a number of different ways. So if you can think about how we can specifically improve the way we engage, the modalities, the approaches that we use, the tools that we employ, we'd be grateful for some feedback. Even though there's only a few of these consultations remaining, we still have an opportunity to do better. And that's essentially what we'd like to do, is to improve the level of engagement and offer more of an opportunity for stakeholders like yourselves to feedback to us. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. On the next slide, you will see the guide questions again, and we're also looking forward to sharing experiences. There's a countdown timer in the top right-hand corner. As that countdown timer approaches 0, you will know that it's time to return to your screens. We also will have some background music playing, and that background music, as it fades, will also give you an indication that it's time to return to your screens. So with that, let's take a 5-minute stretch break and see you all back here soon. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have part 2 of our open discussion as continued by Zonabel Woods of the ADB. You've seen some guide questions, but also feel free to share your experiences on how ADB can better target or improve OP2 and the gender and related safeguards issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement. Some of you have already opted to post your questions anonymously, and that's good to see. Once again, a reminder that if you do wish to pose a question, share an experience, and not reveal your name, please send the message in the chat box to either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, or in fact, any other person who has a co-host status on the Zoom call. They are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will repost your question to protect your identity and offer you anonymity. And then we're going to, after this second Q&A session, a reminder, have a Zoom poll as well as some other evaluations. But for now, let me please turn you over to Zonabel Woods. Zoni, if you please.
Thank you. So we have about 3 questions in the queue. And if anyone would also like to ask questions, please put up your hand. But for now, we have 2 anonymous questions, so I'm just going to read those out. The first one is actually a suggestion that we have gender-specific occupational health and safety safeguards and provisions in internationally financial institution funded projects. So looking at worksite facilities, separate toilets, etc., adequate gender specific or gender neutral PPE provision, protective equipment provision, provisions such as maternity leave and other social security measures. And that there should be gender-friendly policies and more opportunities for women and girls in ADB-funded projects. So that is a suggestion that includes some very specific things that ADB should be included in the projects. Then we have a second comment, anonymous comment. In our country, pregnant women still have to take permission from their husband and mother-in-law to receive medical care. So what will you consider when drawing up a new strategy? So that's the second question. And then we have a third question from Pirzoda Torsh Murad. And she has been working in Tibet in Tajikistan project, and there is a first output, competency-based training, and in this frame of this output, 70 competency standards of the occupations and curricula have been developed. So while they were developing the curricula for the 17 different occupations, they noted that experts should take into consideration gender aspects and include gender sensitive aspects to curricula, which was something that was difficult. So the question is, how should experts include gender sensitive aspects in curricula? So I think some of these questions are actually, they are both in terms of ADB's overall gender work and gender designs and projects, and perhaps the first question addresses a bit more sort of the safeguards related issues. So I will turn to Sam first to comment on the first 2, one that relates to facilities that are and gender designs that can be included in our projects, as well as the issue of persistent gender norms in countries where women still have to take permissions from their husbands. And then the question on TVET, which maybe Malika would like to come in and also respond to. So I'll hand it over to you, Sam, and then Bruce, if you also have some comments on this.
Sure, Zoni. I was thinking actually maybe Malika would want to just jump in. We haven't heard from her. And she could maybe probably cover both sides of it in terms of the, gender sensitive infrastructure facilities as well as TVET. I think there's quite a lot we could say in this area. Malika, you want to?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Zoni. So maybe I'll start with a question from Perzo. That's a very interesting question, and this is something that we've been paying attention to for quite a long time. Ensuring that curricular textbooks and the materials that are used for teaching do not reinforce gender biases is a very important area. So we need to ensure that the materials are gender balanced, that the teachers who are teaching, so especially in the STEM areas and in the areas of study that are usually male dominated. So we have role models who will be also showing that there are opportunities for career development, there are opportunities for skills development for girls, and to ensure that the curricula do not reinforce gender biases, but also kind of promote girls' participation in STEM, girls' participation in the studies like engineering, where usually you will find less number of girls pursuing this career. And we shouldn't just stop at that, because there are several studies that also found that girls, and not only in developing countries, but also in the developed countries, that after graduation, for example, from engineering studies, many girls do not pursue their career and not joining the companies because there are very specific requirements that would not allow them to address the issues that are related to multiple roles of women, like handling household responsibilities, taking care of kids, and at the same time being able to grow through their professional career. In terms of the questions on infrastructure, accessibility, affordability, and specific gender designs. I think Sam already mentioned that one of the requirements for any gender mainstreaming for project is having gender analysis being as a part of the due diligence for any project. And this is where we identify the key issues that women are facing in terms of the access to infrastructure. And this usually allow us to identify the key designs that needs to be included in the project. And then it's not only done during the project preparation, during due diligence, but also during the consultations project, during the implementation of the project through consultations. We also pay attention to the fact that in many countries, it was, I think in one of the comments was saying that in many countries, women, for example, would not be very vocal if we have a focus group discussions or interviews in the mixture or in the mixed groups. And in many projects, you will find when the women-only consultations are organized, we always ensure that the meetings and consultations are organized at time and place that is accessible to women and that allows them, again, to address the issues that related to time poverty and their multiple responsibilities at the household and community level. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. So I think we have Bruce. Did you want to come in, or Madhu, on the issue of occupational health and safety, provision of PPP? You had also spoken to that earlier, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just briefly, thank you, Sonny, to the comments that came in anonymously. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's certainly an area that needs more specific, I think, implementation support for our contractors, for the executing and implementing agencies that work with us. It's already clear within the policy that you need to provide PPE and of course gender issues need to be integrated there. That's something that we can make clearer in the new policy, but I think a lot of work has to be done at the capacity level to make sure that best practices are implemented on work sites. And of course, to be able to monitor those effectively to make sure that it actually is happening in practice and that women have access to those facilities. But it's very well taken. So thank you for that comment. I also wanted just to speak briefly to the other anonymous comment that mentioned about pregnant women and the requirement in your country to have permission from a husband or other relative. So it's a tricky issue, and I think it's probably one that colleagues in the gender team may have other thoughts on, but something that we need to make sure of is in the context of a workplace where you have occupational health and safety risks and the need for on-site medical support of workers, that everyone has equal access to that. So, you know, from a site level health and safety issues. Of course, in projects where there are social norms and cultural issues or legal barriers, that obviously needs to be considered as part of project design and thought through carefully. Consultation processes can help us to understand that better. But we do need to think through how we can provide the access to the facilities safely in a work context. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. We have two more hands up. People would like to speak, but just also, as I think it's important to note that we're talking about some issues that are also both related to the safeguard policy review, but as well as sort of how ADB in our projects and in operations, we integrate gender. So, many of the things that Sam and Malika have talked about sort of are really related to how we design projects that include activities and targets that have the aim of reducing existing gender inequalities. So I will ask Mr. Ahmed to take the floor, followed by Abia Akram. Mr. Ahmed, you have the floor. You're on mute. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your first name. It's Kutubuddin.
This is Kutubuddin Ahmed. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for giving me the floor to say some words about the issue of health and safety and vulnerability of the women. I have every admiration to the Asia Development Bank, those who have undertaken a very good project for the betterment, for the emancipation of the people, particularly in the developing country, least developed country. So I would like to say that in my country, Bangladesh, women has been suffering immensely because they have been working in the RMG sector and other sector. And perhaps you know that about 80% women have been working in the RMG sector. So they have to face multiple problems. Like during the COVID-19, I think, so far my knowledge goes, they did not get the vaccination properly. And despite government workers have been getting 6 months maternity leave, only 4 months maternity leave has been allowed for the RMG sector workers. It is, I think, it is absolutely disparity. So I would like to request ADB to take a closer look about the when project is going to be undertaken, a awareness development work should be done in my country, Bangladesh. On the other hand, women have been suffering immensely in the climate change. Perhaps you know, Bangladesh has been facing tremendous problem of climate change, like flood water, and the Bangladesh, the coastal country of Bay of Bengal. So it has become a common phenomena of natural calamity, that is natural, they have to face natural catastrophe. But women are facing problem than that of the men. So in this regard, ADB should include, when they will take a project, they should include this, particularly women awareness development and capacity building should be undertaken. On the other hand, I think perhaps you know, Sri Lankan workers have been suffering immensely, though they are other country, but they are our neighboring country. The recent political catastrophe, the workers have been suffering. They are not getting their food properly, and I think what role ADB has been playing, I don't know. They should also give their attention to the working people of the Sri Lanka. And the economy of Bangladesh, perhaps you know, economy of Bangladesh is more strengthening, strong, but in the recent recent problem of COVID-19, but we have already overcome. But despite that, we have many things to do. We have long way to do, a long way to go for the betterment of the women folk and the working people. And I think if the countries, those where ADB has been working, our workers, they should also take a special attention to the working people of my country, Bangladesh. And because Bangladesh people are more, women are more facing more vulnerability, and apparently it has been saying that the workers of my country has been doing a lot for the economic development of this country. So and we are proactive, and we are working very proactively for the betterment. But Asian Development Bank can do many things for the betterment of the working people in my country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those comments, Mr. Kutu Budin. We probably have time for just one more very brief question. So I will, Abia, you started us off. So you also get the last question, and then we'll go back to our ADB colleagues. So Abia, you have the floor for a very brief question, please.
Sure. No, thank you so much. I'll just talk very briefly. I just want to add one point regarding the recommendations for the safeguard policy and how we can move with that. I'll again talk from the disability perspective, and especially women and girls with disability. So how we can make the whole ADB processes inclusive, like adopting the reasonable accommodation, capacity building trainings of the whole staff from the top management to the bottom. You have mentioned already about the framework. So within that framework, how we can assist in accessibility audits and making your websites more inclusive, and the territories like all these TVATs, how we can make them also inclusive, and creating the job opportunities for women and girls with disabilities, so they could be hired as on the managerial top positions and on interns and all. So that was like just a structure. If you need further details on that, we have all the documents, and we are working with different corporate sectors on that, so we can share the development organizations as well. So we can share, and also you talk about the gender-based violence and sexual harassment at workplace. So how we can make those policies more inclusive in terms of women and girls with disability, psychosocial support we can provide, and like few other areas we can cover in a specific programs on women with disability, and on the other hand, mainstreaming the whole organization on the disability. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Abia. And if you could please direct us to the resources that you have mentioned on women and disabilities. We'd really welcome those, as well as we'd love to share those with our colleagues that are working specifically on disability at ADB. So I think, so that's our last question. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. So I will hand it back to our colleagues from Safeguards, and also if you have any other comments to the last two questions that have been raised, Sam, Malika, and Bruce, and afterwards, Azim, I hand it back to you to conclude our session.
Thanks so much, Zonibel. Thanks also to Samantha, Malika, Zainab, Madhu, and Bruce, as well as others, including those from the events management and SEP teams. But of course, a special and huge thanks to you. We've been all ears, and we'll take on board your suggestions, some of which have been very, very practical today. Thanks to the participation, thanks to all of you as informants for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of your experiences, and the constructive feedback. I would like to reiterate that the comments on the study on gender in Asia and the Pacifics that are received from this consultation will be considered in the preparation of the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of the ADB standard and the updating of the safeguards policy. But please don't go. As I mentioned, we have some questions for you. We have one Zoom poll that I'd like to be flashed on the screen now. And on a scale of 1 to 5, please rank this particular consultation on how satisfied you were with the deliberations and today's discussions and the general level of interaction in the session. So just go to your handsets, go to your laptops, go to your computers, go to your devices, tap in a number between 1 to 5 and respond to the Zoom poll question. How satisfied were you with today's session? 5 is the highest rank you can give, and 1 is the lowest. And of course, we're happy to accept anything in between. That was question number 1. Question number 2, you can fill out at your leisure, as well as question number 3, or poll number 2 and poll number 3, both of which are online polls that you can take first using the menti.com app, and that has been flashed in the chat box. The question for that is, how can we improve the level of engagement, the level of discourse, the level of consultation with you? Is there something specifically or some things specifically that the ADB can do to improve the consultations? We'd like to hear from you and your 3, 4, 5 sentences on how specifically these consultations can be improved. And then the third poll is a post-event evaluation survey. And that questions, or those questions, essentially gauge the level of satisfaction at a more deeper level on what your original expectations were and were those expectations met through this particular consultation. All of these are designed to help the ADB improve the way it engages with you. Of course, we're limited now because all of these consultations are being done virtually. But under the circumstances, how well has the ADB engaged and consulted and liaised with you to solicit feedback, opinion, and gauge your experiences from the field from a practical level and use to inform the eventual safeguards policy? That's what we want to know. So with that, I'd like to wrap up poll number 1, the Zoom poll. We've got 17% of you who have said that this was neither exceptionally satisfactory nor dissatisfactory. And we have about 84%, 83% who say that they are somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied. We would like to hear from all of you that have responded on how these engagements could be improved, because that will only strengthen the way we interact with you, not only under this consultation, but future consultations. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Bruce Dunn, who is the overall leader of this process, to give us a summary of what we've heard and walk us through the next steps after this particular consultation. Bruce, if you could review the discussions and give us the indicative next steps, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Azim, and huge thanks to all of the participants from today. It's really interesting and very, very useful for us to hear your comments and recommendations. I've been taking a lot of notes of the key points, and we do prepare meeting summaries for all of these sessions, which we will be making available again to participants in due course once we've finished putting those together. Of course, all of your comments and recommendations are extremely valuable in helping us to look at our existing operations and implementation, how we can strengthen those, and then also feeding into the policy itself. Now, quite a great range of topics were raised today. Let me just try to highlight a number of the key issues. I won't go through all of the details, but just try to capture some of the key points that have been important. Firstly, we did talk on both the safeguards, the more project level risk management aspects, as well as the wider need for a proactive agenda, and how ADB takes forward a proactive agenda on gender equality in ADB. Linked to that, we also clearly heard from some of you about the challenges in your countries, including those that relate to either gaps in the legal frameworks, or where those legal frameworks do exist, where they're not respected or implemented, and the need to continue work there on awareness raising and building, obviously, strong legal frameworks that are implemented. Coming to some of the safeguard issues that were raised, one very important one is around strengthening gender-sensitive consultation processes. And of course, underpinning that has to be a good collection of data, understanding the project and the gender dimensions, and being able to take a very inclusive approach that has to take into consideration, the time and place of consultations, making sure it's accessible and safe to be able to really understand the views of different participants of different genders. Clearly, we need to work more on gender-sensitive project design. You heard from my colleagues from the gender group about how we approach that and areas that we're working to strengthen. That includes on things such as gender-sensitive project facilities. Next, I talked a little bit about intersectionality. This was a key issue. Actually, I think we started with the first comments that were raised in the consultation about the relationships between gender and disability. And we spoke there about some of the work that ADB is doing on the disability framework and gender and disability toolkit. But as my colleague Madhu mentioned, there are a range of vulnerable groups, disadvantaged groups, marginalized groups that need to be considered, and we're actually looking to strengthen our whole approach on vulnerability and the safeguards. And obviously that intersects with the gender issues as well. So that is clearly an area that we need to look at. For the safeguard policy itself, that obviously covers a wide range of issues. Gender is a cross-cutting issue, but as we work through areas such as labor or community health and safety, occupational health and safety issues, or how we implement resettlement, land acquisition processes, gender has to clearly and in a nuanced way look at how it applies across those various different issues. Particularly though on labor, this was something that we picked up through a number of speakers. We had representatives from different labour organisations, trade unions today. We appreciated your participation. So that was key. Some aspects related to the need to strengthen labour and working conditions more generally at country levels and project levels, but then some aspects more specifically on gender. Non-discrimination in hiring practices, equal opportunity, equal pay, addressing risks of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, having grievance redress mechanisms that would be free of retaliation. Also around worker health and safety, having the right facilities, personal protective equipment that are gender sensitive, worker accommodation. So, there's a lot of issues there around labour. And of course, targeting women's employment is another aspect that relates to that. Then obviously implementation remains a challenge, and that's an area that we need to continue to work and strengthen on. And we heard a number of you mention around contractor issues, working with subcontractors, and non-implementation issues that, or non-compliance issues, I should say, that need to be strengthened more. And some had recommended also clearly the role of unions and civil society. But I think this also points to the need for strengthening, obviously, capacity and then monitoring. In addition to that, there was a range of, let's say, more sector-specific issues that were raised, for example, around making education curricula more gender sensitive, and also looking at climate change and how women are more vulnerable to that, which of course is a project level issue, but also a whole agenda in itself in terms of how we support climate resilience through our countries and support to your, say, climate action plans or nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. So a lot of areas that we've covered, and I think I've only just briefly summarized key points. Now, next steps, we are coming to the end of this regional consultation processes. Some additional sessions will still be had, as I mentioned, including, if you're interested in gender, next week, special session on sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. And then the following week, we'll be talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. We touched a little bit on some of those topics today, but we will go more in depth in those sessions. However, once we move out of these thematic topics and regional consultations, we will be doing more in a number of countries to do country-focused consultations. So please do stay tuned for those. There will be opportunities for dedicated civil society consultations in a number of countries, which will be happening over the next 3 or 4 months. Plus, we are doing some consultations with project affected people in a number of projects. That will all then feed into the drafting of the policy, and we are looking to have a draft policy available by about September or October this year. That will be publicly disclosed, and then we will go into some further rounds of consultation, in addition to seeking any written submissions about the draft policy itself. So we have a lot to do, and we appreciate you being involved as partners in this process. It will make it a better policy, and we really do value your contributions. So thank you once again for joining, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to meet again in future consultations or in person in the future. Until then, stay safe and take care. Thank you.